Now, yesterday, most of you were here, we discussed what went wrong and led to the First World War, and why and how the war came about, and of course what were the results and the outcome that resulted and came out of the war. Today we'll have a different approach. Today will be more political, I hope, and we'll be discussing whether we've learned any lessons, and if we have, well, let's say whether there were lessons to be learned, first of all, whether we've learned those lessons and how we apply this experience, how we apply it in today's world order and the various problems and crises that we find all over around us. It's a great honor for me to be the moderator in such a very distinguished panel of speakers. We have a combination of politicians, diplomats, academic, and not separately. Most of our speakers combine all three, and this gives a unique perspective. So the question will be whether we've learned our lessons, whether we applied and we will apply what we've learned. And one could easily question that after the First World War, which we're discussing today, the anniversary, there were many other global wars. The Second World War, or large-scale wars, I should say, the Korean War that involved superpowers, we had the Vietnam War, and all the other conflicts and interventions and invasions and crises that maybe didn't reach a global scale of conflict and fighting, limited in geography, limited in duration, but as we know, unfortunately, can be just as deadly. So the question will be how, and I think we've learned that already yesterday, how the First World War affected the Middle East, which is the specific topic we'll be discussing today. Well, it did by causing the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. That is clear historically. So we had the development or the process of developing new states of old nations. Being in the region myself, I have to say, the nations pre-existed the states, and the people pre-exist, of course, the states, but then we have new borders, not necessarily correct historically, which means disputed borders, crises, clashes, conflicts, and maybe wars. So are there lessons to be learned from the World War I, or is that obsolete, given what has happened since then? After all, the independence of the countries in the region more or less came about for most of them, not all of course, for most of them after the Second World War, when the decolonization trend started. So is there any relevance? And that's what we'll be discussing today. And is there something, more importantly, and this is the big question, is there something we can do from that experience to avoid history repeating itself? Well, based on the previous speaker, we cannot, but anyway, I hope we can get a more optimistic outcome. Now, before I go to my seat there and give the floor to the panelists and the speakers, I have to make a couple of practical information, give practical information. We'll follow a different approach today. I will ask our distinguished speakers to speak for 10-15 minutes each, because I hope we can have a second round of interventions so they could comment on each other's interventions as well. And of course, to have time to take more questions and comments from the floor. And finally, when I go there, I will introduce the speakers one by one before they speak. I have to apologize beforehand. If you Google the speakers, you'll find pages and pages and pages of what they've done, what they've accomplished, pages of CVs. So I had to be arbitrary. So in introducing, I have very limited time. So I will mention what I consider important, and I hope you will share that with me. So I'll be moving there and introduce the first speaker. Thank you. So the first speaker will be Mr. Haim Ramon from Israel. Haim has been elected many times to the Knesset, has served as Interior Minister, Minister of Health, and as a former EU Commissioner of Health, I have to point out that he was a brain behind the health revolution, creating or recreating, maybe is the word, the National Health Insurance Plan in Israel. He also, and that's very interesting from a political point of view, he was, I think that was Ariel Sharon's description, the father of the disengagement concept. So concentrating his efforts at that time as minister without portfolio to carry out the disengagement from the Gaza Strip. Later on, he served as vice prime minister with Prime Minister Olmert. And of course, he served in other political positions. He's also now involved in many business activities, and I want to choose my favorite one, and that's being the owner of Hapoel Football Club. And being in the region, we follow very closely what's going on in football in Israel. So that's my favorite one. Now, Mr. Ramon has very detailed and specific views on how the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be. And I would be very interested actually to know how these have been accepted and received by both the Israelis and the Palestinians. Some can be a little advanced, one could say, or bold. And also he has views on how the role of the international community should be in not only resolving, but also dealing with this issue after its resolution. But I'm tempted to ask, after what's been going on the last few weeks, how do the developments affect his views, given the fact that now we have the new Palestinian government, which consists both of Fatah and Hamas. Therefore, we have Israel withdrawing from the negotiations, so they have come to a standstill. I can't say they were doing very well, but they've come to a standstill now. So are these ideas and views realistic now? So these are some of my questions. Don't feel obliged to answer them, but feel free to take the floor. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Because now I'm not an active politician, I will try to answer your questions, things that I didn't do when I was a politician. Thank you, Markos, and thank you, Ward, for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel. I want to say something for the beginning. I think that Mr. Friedman, when he spoke about the world, he didn't pay attention to the Middle East. And I think it makes sense. Why? Because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that used to be in the center of the international agenda is not longer anymore in the focus of the international community. Since 1973, let's say 1973, 40 years ago, was the last war between Israel and neighbor countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan. Since then, 1973, no more war between Israel and Arab countries. All the operations, military operations that took place in the between Israel and the conflict was with with terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and so on. And the major military operation was against that kind of terrorist organization. It was the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the first Lebanon War, the second Lebanon War, and in between, small operations against terrorist actions. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict became a conflict between, I can say, tribes, between maybe two nations, no more than that. Especially after the Arab Spring. Nobody really paid attention what will happen between Israel and the Palestinians. Egypt is Egypt. All what's happened in Egypt concentrate now in the domestic affairs after Assisi was elected as president, and after Morsi, and after Mubarak. When Mubarak was in power, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a major issue for Egypt. No more. Saudi, the most important thing for Saudi is Iran, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Syria doesn't exist as a state any longer. So when Mr. Freeman talked about the oil price, it has nothing to do today with the Israel-Palestinian conflict. This was not the situation in 1973 and even a decade or 2 decades after that. So we are alone. Israel and the Palestinians basically are alone. Even Secretary of State Kerry tried to do his best, and probably his best wasn't enough in this case, and tried to bring Israel and the Palestinians to a kind of an agreement, but he failed. And he failed also because it's not a very important conflict anymore. Otherwise, the United States would use much more power to enforce their influence on Israel and the Palestinians. On the other hand, something very strange happened. Both sides, Israel and the Palestinians, and I'm talking of the public opinion, the public opinion in Israel and the Palestinians are very close on what has to be the solution. Everybody knows at the end of the day what will be the solution. It will be a two-state solution based on 67 borders with a swap of about 4, 5, 3%. Blocks of settlement will be annexed to Israel, and Israel will give in return land from the state of Israel by swap. Jerusalem, the Jewish neighbor, including those behind the Green Line, will remain under Israeli sovereignty. The Palestinians' neighborhood will be the capital of the Palestinian state, and they will be under the Palestinian sovereignty, and the Holy Basin will have a special regime. And the refugee problem will be solved by the Palestinian refugee will return to the Palestinian state, the Jewish refugee in a way will come to Israel, and it will be a kind of humanitarian and unification of families, that Palestinians that will be returned to Israel by the permission of the government of Israel as from humanitarian reasons. Well, that's what will be. More than that, the Palestinians today agree to something that they failed to agree, and Mr. Moratinos and myself try to convince them that this is the right thing to do, that let's first agreed on border and security. And on border and security, we are very close, more than on the other issues. And what will be agreed on that is agreed. And this is a big change. And I can talk about the Israeli public opinion today about borders and security, and the idea of the two-state solution. When I was in favor of two-state solution about 25 years ago in the Labour Party, about 2-3% of the Labour Party support this idea. Today it's a consensus in the Labour Party, but it's almost a consensus in the State of Israel about let's say 70% of the population support it, and even among the Jewish population, about 65% support the two-state solution. So a big change, tremendous change. The idea of two-state solution was something that was totally unaccepted by almost all the parties in Israel 20 years ago. And among the Palestinians, it's more or less the same. So, what's the problem now? The problem? Again, leadership. That's the main problem. And I don't want to blame this leader or the other leader, but I can talk about, as an Israeli, from my point of view. I didn't vote for Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. I didn't vote either for Netanyahu, but he is my prime minister. So when I'm talking to the prime minister, I have to talk to my prime minister and to convince the people of Israel that the prime minister of Israel is going in the wrong direction. And what's important for Israel today is one major thing. How Israel will maintain as a Jewish and a democratic state. This is the most important point from our point of view, from what we believe. And the status quo will not maintain. When I'm speaking with people in Israel, I'm starting from the end, and I'm telling them, the status quo will not maintain because one simple fact. The simple fact is that Israel will not be the only nation in the world that occupied 3-4 million people without political rights. It will not maintain. And because the end of this situation could be the two-state solution, but if it will not be the two-state solution, it will be the one-state solution. And a one-state solution means that it will be one state, Palestinians and Israelis together, and that means it will be a binational state, and it will be the end of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. So the two-state solution is as essential interest of the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It's not an essential interest of the Palestinians. I think they want it. But as an Israeli, when I'm speaking about it, I'm speaking what is essential for my own people. And this is the major interest of Israel. So when the Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying, oh, we have to blame the Palestinians, why the negotiation failed, why we are not making progress on the peace process, it's not important. Let's accept what the Prime Minister is saying. So what? Is he saying, okay, if this is the situation, let's maintain the status quo. But the status quo is a major danger for the state of Israel. So we have to change the status quo. And what we have to do is to propose to the Palestinians, okay, we fail on the issue of the refugee, we fail the issue of Jerusalem, let's speak about borders and security, and in this case we can reach an agreement. It's clear we can reach an agreement. And therefore, the major problem today in Israel is the debate about what we have to do now. So what I think we have to do now is first to present the Israeli plan. Prime Minister Netanyahu failed in the last 5 years to present any plan. What he really thinks about the future of the state of Israel. And let's say that the Palestinians will reject the plan. So it's a win-win situation. The international community will support us. And it will be legitimate the fact that we can take unilateral steps, because we will not accept the status quo. I remember I was the deputy prime minister when Ehud Olmert was the prime minister, and I, on behalf of him, negotiated with Mahmoud Abbas about the solution. And we came very close. In June 2008, I visited Abu Mazen, he's an old friend of mine, and I came to Amman and I presented to him a DOP, Declaration of Principles. And I told him, Abu Mazen, listen, this is the last minute to accept it. We will not last, we will not stay in power in the next election. And the next election will take place in a year. And Netanyahu will come. And if we will miss this opportunity, both of us, Israelis and Palestinians, will pay a price. Unfortunately, I didn't succeed to convince him then. And after that, when Prime Minister Olmert proposed to him the proposal in September 2008, it was too late. It was almost the end of the term of Prime Minister Olmert, and we missed a golden opportunity. But at the end of the day, this DOP that was presented by me and by Prime Minister Olmert and by myself, that will be the solution. And the only question, what price both sides will pay till we will reach the solution that it's clear to both sides that this is the only solution, and that's what will happen in the future. And I hope it will happen in the very near future, because otherwise we will pay with bloodshed and life of innocent people from both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Haim. Thank you, Haim. It was, I suppose, what we heard is missed opportunities and lack of leadership and running out of time. So this is a grim lesson, I should say. Our next speaker is Dr. Mohamed Benaïssa. And he's a politician, he's a diplomat, but what I like more is that he's a man of culture and human development. And he has studied journalism, both in Egypt and in the United States. He worked for the United Nations. He passed, I think, all the phases of public office: city councillor, mayor, member of parliament. He's still a mayor, actually, Vasila. Member of parliament, minister of culture, minister of foreign affairs and cooperation. What I find very interesting is that Dr. Benaïssa maintains the belief that social and cultural development are intrinsically interdependent. He was the founder or co-founder of the Asila Forum Foundation, a very important foundation doing excellent work, and he has been recognized by many prestigious awards and decorations worldwide. And I would just point out that he's a laureate of the Aga Khan Award for Islamic Architecture. Now, Dr. Benaïssa, I'm not sure, I don't think he's a true believer on lessons learned. He will tell us now, maybe I got it wrong, which will be a bit disappointing. We haven't learned anything, but I'll give him the floor to explain all this to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. the nice introduction, actually, which is just a bit exaggerated from my side. If you'd allow me, before going to the subject matter, in fact, of this debate, which is lessons learned from the First World War, I would like to make just a little comment on Mr. Ramon's outstanding intervention, I must say. You said, perhaps, referring to Mr. Friedman's also statement, that there is no more focus in the world today, as it used to be in the past, on the Arab-Israeli issue, which is true. But what you did not say, and Mr. Friedman did not say, that anything can erupt and bring back the Arab-Israeli into big focus, particularly today with the so-called Islamic mouvance, the political Islam, as some call it, is very much oriented to use the Arab-Israeli issue again as a platform, because it's very attractive. It brings back memories to a whole generation of people, and also it brings back incentives to the new generations. This is just a slight remark. Mr. Chairman, when I began to think of what I would say about lessons learned from the tragedy of the 1914, I asked myself, why European tragedy? First World War was a world tragedy. It was indeed a bigger tragedy for our part of the world than it was perhaps for Europe. The Arab world, immediately after the end of the First World War, was devastated, totally devastated. But I will come to this. I just want to make another remark. Another question I was asking myself coming here, when we talk about the Middle East, what do we mean by the Middle East? In the mind of the majority of the people, the Middle East is the Arab countries in Asia, basically, and some in North Africa. And perhaps we underestimate, I wouldn't say that we forget, sometimes we overlook the fact that 2/3 of the Arabs are in Africa. In fact, perhaps 1/3 of the African territory is Arab. If you take it from Mauritania all the way to Somalia, the whole of North Africa, there are today almost 300 million Africans whose countries are members of the Arab League. So I would say, I hope that we can reach the time when we can talk about the Afro-Arab world, or the Arab-Afro world, because also the impact of what's happening in Africa today, as the impact of what's happening in the Middle East and what happened in the past is tremendous on both sides. We cannot talk, for instance, about security today in the Middle East without talking about what's happening in the Red Sea, what's happening in the Sahel. Al-Qaeda now is stretching out all the way from Mali, from Boko Haram, from the Central African Republic, to what's happening elsewhere in Libya and perhaps in some other parts of the Arab world. This is, I just wanted to make this remark because it's, in my view, very important to address the subject of lessons. I'm going to be very brief because this is a subject which can take us to talk about the sub-issues like the Arab-Israeli issue. It's just one sub-issue of the bigger Middle Eastern issue. I think the first lesson we have learned from the First World War was to mistrust the West and the East, because both, they sat down in Versailles in 1918, and with paper and pen, they sat and they divided, they cut as they tailored their world of the aftermath of the First World War. The whole colonial setup came after the Second World War. Secondly, there was, talking about Israeli-Arab conflict, 1917 was the Balfour Declaration, which set the basics of the foundation of Israel, but also implicitly, perhaps without having that in mind, set the path for the dispersion of the Palestinians, which is, for the Arabs, by and large, is the tragedy we were talking about earlier. The First World War resulted fundamentally on the disappearance of the Ottoman Khilafah. In other words, it was the end of the Khilafah Islamiyah in history. It was the end. In other words, the emperorship of power-wise, of ideology, which was then Islam, disappeared. And a new ideology, of another imperial ideology began, which is the Soviet, the communist, the spread of communism, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the colonial, imperial era we have known, you know. And finally, I would say, one outcome of the First World War, which was disastrous, is the Holocaust. It started way back. The Nazi movement and the way it massacred 6 million Jews just because they are Jewish, I take it as a fundamental point in that process of what has happened after the First World War, and of course the Second World War and thereafter. I would say the second element, a lesson we learned from the First World War, was the spirit of alienation which prevailed in many parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, of which we are suffering today, even in Africa. Sheikh Tijan, before you came, I spoke on your behalf, insisting that we cannot talk about the Arab world and the Middle East without Africa, and vice versa.
Thank you very much.
Both the African part of the Middle East, I would call it, and the Asian part of the Middle East suffer from this alienation. Some take it from, in a way, easily because it's a cultural thing. It's not. Because one of the results of this mistrust that I was talking about was the repression of which suffered millions of people being colonized. Their dignity was hurt, and their fundamental basics of their thinking lost identity. I think no one can, and perhaps many of you, particularly in Europe, do not see it, but we are living a very big crisis today. They call it a crisis of education. It is a crisis of identity. In our families, our children do not speak one language at once. In fact, some have forgotten their mother tongue. We are today devastated. In other words, even in what we want. Our choices are conditioned naturally by our knowledge. And our knowledge is fuzzy. When one asks himself or herself, who am I wonder who really has the right answer. Many, I would say a generation today, they do not have a depth of their knowledge of the self which goes beyond, let's say, 30, 40 years. And this is an issue which is rarely raised. Yesterday, when Dr. Clark and his colleagues here, they were talking about the First World War, none of them has spoken about the cultural dimension of what has happened. We talk about economics, about energy, about oil, about territory, about this, but what has happened to human beings? I believe that in the process of what has happened after the First World War, we are faced as a result of what someone yesterday called it the management of diversity. We cannot manage our diversities today, even national diversities. This is something that took place way back in 1918 at Versailles. 80 years ago, 90 years ago is not too long. In fact, some people who were born in 1918 or 20, they're still alive. And finally, I would like to end by saying that the First World War taught us, or they made us focus on the fact that the period of colonialization that Africa and the Arab world, the Middle East, have known marked the building of good infrastructure. Many African countries and Middle East countries did not have electricity, did not have water, no railroads, highways, all that was built. But that resulted also in the birth of the alienation. I was just telling Miguel Ángel this morning, we were having breakfast, that when France and Spain left Morocco in 1956, we had not a single college, no university. In fact, the Spanish part limited high school for Moroccans to only 4 years. And the maximum that my generation could get in northern Morocco, because I come from the part which was under Spanish administration, I wouldn't say colonialism, Miguel Ángel. My generation, the utmost that could look for was to be a teacher, primary school teacher, or a post-master, you know. I say it seriously. And I had to leave Morocco at the age of 16 to go to Egypt to be able to have my baccalaureate, to finish my high school. That's what brought me to go to Egypt. So this is what I really meant by the alienation, and I consider this is something that we have learned. I hope our children can be better than us to overcome this very tragic situation. And I do not mean by that we have to come back to ourselves, to any national closeness. What I mean is to work with the world, with us full, like the other are full. Thank you, sir.
So there are lessons learned, and it's not just a European tragedy, and that's something to correct. Led to colonization, cultural effects, and the challenge to manage diversity. Now, the next speaker, very well known, Miguel Ángel Moratinos, who has committed his professional and political activity to international relations and development cooperation. He began his diplomatic career at the dawn, or the rebirth, I would say, of Spanish democracy. He has served in the embassy of Spain in Belgrade, and I think that's important. That's how he started, I think. And he was involved in many aspects of the topic we're discussing today. He took part in the organization of what is now historic Middle East Peace Conference in Madrid in 1992. He has served as Spain's ambassador in Israel, and he was appointed as European Union's special representative for the Middle East peace process. And that's important for me as well, because that brought him to Cyprus, being the center of the Middle East region and European country. He lived there for that period. He was also elected after the diplomatic career, elected as a member of parliament for the Socialist Party, and served as foreign minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Spain. He did work, and have personal experience on this, on effective multilateralism, and the alliance of civilizations is one of the, I would say, important brainchilds of Miguel Ángel. He was awarded numerous distinctions, and I will only mention the one which I think is relevant today, is the Order of the Serbian Flag, First Class. Now, of course, he has experience of Europe, of the Middle East. He may want to say whether the Middle East is more stable today, and if there's more now, after what happened in the past, more security and peace, if you take into account what's happening in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, the Middle East peace process at a standstill, and I would add, is the European Western policy on these issues the right one? Miguel Ángel, have the floor.
Dobar dan, dragi prijatelji. Thank you, Markos, for this presentation. Let me first congratulate the organizer and of course our friend Vuk for having this initiative, to gather together to recall this First World War, the legacy, the failures, the miscalculation, the elements that led to this tremendous and abominable and unacceptable conflict, and look today to learn some lessons. Yesterday we had the chance to listen the historians. Today we have politicians, so the one who miscalculate, the one who have the courage to take decision, the one that don't have the vision to plan a better future. So let's change. Why not? Politicians, for once, can be more smart and more, ready to take, the world on their hands with the responsibility of the people that they represent, and having a different, results. So, in order to be brief, let me compare what was the Middle East in 1914, and let's say, as my dear friend Mohamed say, 1918, the Paris Conference, the Versailles Treaty, and today's Middle East. Well, in order to compare, I will use three layers. First, the international context. Second, the interest. And third, the parties. Well, international context, everybody agree. It has been referred from Markos today, from yesterday, from everybody, that was the fall of Ottoman Empire. I mean, you will not bring Middle East to this audience today if, the fall of Ottoman Empire has not collapsed and had given, the birth to what more or less is the same map, I will come back to that, of today's Middle East. I mean, you look to the map and then you will see Mesopotamia, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, but it was, under Ottoman leadership. You have the interest. Let me recall in a book of, a very good book I recommend, of Margaret Macmillan, The Peacemakers, he mentioned a quotation from Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee was an advisor of Prime Minister Lord George. So they were in Paris in the conference, and so Arnold Toynbee was bringing to the Prime Minister a piece of paper to have a speaking note, we will say today, to the Prime Minister, and he remained beside him. And Lord George, without taking into account that Arnold Toynbee was beside him, he speak thinking loudly, and he say, Mesopotamia, yes, oil, irrigation, yes, we will take Mesopotamia. Then say, Palestine, yes, the Holy See, the Holy Land, and Zionism, yes, we will take Palestine. Then say Syria, what the Brits have in Syria, we couldn't get, no, let that for the French. So that was the typical traditional way to identify interest and to get involved in this part of the region of the Middle East. So these interests were combined with the parties. Which parties were there at this time? Well, there was the British and the French colonial interests, as Mohamed said. And there was Sykes-Picot Agreement. Let's recall today that in 2 years' time, we will have 100 years from Sykes-Picot Agreement. And 3 years later, as you mentioned, also Mohamed, we will have a Balfour Declaration. So we are coming to the 1 year's commemoration similar to the First World War. So all these elements have influenced, unfortunately till now, the future and the reality of today's Middle East. So if we now go to today's Middle East, because just before that, say the United States, it was at the beginning, they have no real stand in the Middle East. Of course, they were trying to be part of that. Russia also was trying to be part, but really the French, Anglo-French influence in the Middle East was predominant at this period. Well, today we look to the map and we have international context. Yesterday, Jeffrey Sachs has come to us in a very brilliant speech, and today Mr. Freeman the same. The tremendous change of international relations. We cannot identify one factor or one element, but we all agree, we make a poll today, that everybody is waiting a total new order in international relations. We are feeling that. The old order of 45, the UN system, the international institution, the lack of leadership of the United States, of Europe, is gone. Well, we are now coming to a new order. We know that. It's something that is going to appear maybe sooner than we are expecting. So we are like the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We don't know what is going to be in the next few years, maybe this summer. Always for diplomats to be on holiday in summer is very bad, because every time something happens in August, September, always summer break is very bad for international relations. So maybe this summer we are surprised that there's a new confrontation, a new confrontation, then new order will appear. But we all are aware that due to demographic reason, due to technological reason, due to environmental issue, due to the geopolitical issue, the world has totally changed. So we are more or less like in 1914. The world is changing. And we have the same interest in the Middle East. Let's look at that. Yes, we have oil and energy, but it's unfortunate that Mr. Friedman is not here, but the Americans are telling us that they are not more interested in the gas, in the oil in the Middle East because they have the gas shell. And they are selling to Europe, even just to cut relations with Russia because they say, no, please come to us because we will have a free and very efficient gas coming from the United States. So one of the reasons, apart the fatigue of the Middle East, and I come with Haim, and I fully agree with him, is that energy in the Middle East is in a different situation. Maybe it will not be the deal between, the 7 sister companies of the United States, the King Abdelaziz of Saudi Arabia. They are not more interested in that. But maybe the Chinese, they need to protect the oil and gas in the Middle East. Or the Russian, as you mentioned. Maybe it's no more the United States because they are now quite secure about oil and gas. So this oil issue is there, but has changed. Well, we have borders, we have the whole agenda, we have territory, that's the permanent conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. You have a strategic, relations, Suez Canal. It was not the same like in the 19th and the 21st century. But you have new challenges. You have the challenge of political Islam. You have the challenge of global terrorism. You have the challenge of nuclear capability of Iran. So there is the old agenda combined with the new agenda. And that new agenda changed, the cards, how to solve or how to stabilize or how to maintain a different Middle East. And what are the parties today? The parties are no more Britain and UK, even in Mr. Sarkozy and Mr. Cameron, they are very nervous and they want to make a first photograph in Tripoli, and they leave thinking that Cyprus is coming back, or even in Syria. They want to be the more warmonger who is going to bomb more, who is going to be more active, trying to have a replace, forgetting that they belong to the European Union. It's unfortunate we cannot debate about European Union, lack of a strategy. It doesn't mean that because we have not a strategy today, we cannot have tomorrow, or the Europeans should build a new strategy in foreign policy, absolutely necessary, and going not back to the old regime on the past. So we have a United States, of course, leadership, but with different interests in the region. We have Russia coming back for the reasons some of you have explained. We have the two main elements that change totally the dimension of today's Middle East compared with 1914. In 1914, only the poor King Faisal was allowed to go to the Paris conference. Not a single Palestinian delegation were unable to go to Paris. No, today you have a state of Israel, and you have the Arab world with a different sense of pride that I try always to convey to my Arab friends. It's finished, this colonial situation. Arab countries now should be aware of their capacity, of the moral support, of the energy, of the resources they have, and have their own say in the Middle East. It's finished. The old regime is not the US or others who have to dictate the future, like Haim Ramon said. It's now the occasion for the parties to take their own future on their hands and try to solve by themselves the challenge and the future of the future generations. So the situation has changed in the context, in the parties, in the interests, and how we, international community, should at least take some lesson from what happened in 1914. I try to be always progressist in my thinking, in my political behavior. I explain myself. Well, I remember when Woodward Wilson launched the 14 points, and he said we should put an end to these kind of secret alliances, the balance of power is over. Let's have a public convenient, even if he's negotiate secretly. Let's have a collective security system, because this, traditional way to conduct international relations has failed. It has conducted us to wars and conflicts. So what is the lesson we are taking at this period of time? If we are now going back to the balance of power. If we are listening to everybody, even Mr. Friedman this morning, we are back that, we have only 3 pillars, international community. We are not mature enough, the people of the today's world, to take a different outlook on how to solve international conflict. I'm not a naive. I know who is the United States. I know what represents China. I know what represents the European Union. But let's be much more, I will say, imaginative and creative for the new world. Let's not go back to the old instrument and the old policy of 1914. Let's change the way we can solve problems. If the UN doesn't work, we will change the UN. If the UN has no response to these challenges, because we are in the old UN. But no, to give the power to Germany only, or to United States, or to Russia, no. We have a global responsibility today. So should we go back to the balance of power? A philosophy and approach that failed? Or should we work for a better future in the Middle East? And for that we need, and I fully agree with Haim Ramon, to let the parties to solve the problems. It is true what he said. It's now not in the agenda. It's more important. I mean, nobody cares about, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And we should care. And I think as Europeans, I will not say as Britain, but if I was Britain, I will take my responsibility. We own to this region and to this part of the world a great debt. Because you cannot send the Arab revolt in one hand and send the national home Jews in another and make them to fight. So at least have the courage to recognize the two states. And now what we Europeans should do, urgently, next morning, we will recognize the Palestinian state and we recognize, the Israeli state, and put them to negotiate as a state, and trying to discuss the borders, and finally, the refugees, the Jerusalem, the settlements, whatever. But we Europeans, we own to the Palestinian, to the region, the recognition of Palestinian state. It's not so difficult. It's no kind of collapse or anti-Israelism. You know why? Because when Ben-Gurion decided in 1948, the 14th of May, to create the state of Israel, he met with the people in Tel Aviv, a group of friends and military, and said, tomorrow I will announce the Israeli state, and I will send a letter to the UN. That is a unilateral action, yes. Why we consider that it's Palestinian decide to create a state is a unilateral action now. If he's engaged in getting a final settlement with their neighbors, that is Israel. So, my dear friend, the world has changed. and I finish with that. I think the Middle East, as Mohamed said, is still there as a point of great threat and risk and disstability. And we should address the future of this region, helping the new parties. And that are the Jewish, the Israel party, the Palestinian, the Arab countries that now have to take their own future together. And the international community, we should accompany that. We should accompany that with a different approach. Yesterday, Professor Paulowicz said that why, when the war in July 1914, nobody could organize international conference. And some scholars, some historians yesterday said because Austria-Hungary didn't allow that. It was their own business. Well, why we don't really call for a global conference in the Middle East where you can put all the elements of the new agenda of international relations? When you solve bilaterally, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, when you can bring the nuclear capability, a kind of organization of security cooperation in the Middle North Africa country, Oxmena. Why you don't bring new ideas to the region to put everybody together trying to solve the problems? And I think that is the only possibility. Professor Clark said yesterday
Miguel,
that, yes, I finished. Professor Clark said today that complexity is one of the key words of today's society. Why we have to be simple when the reality is complex? And I will quote and finish, quoting President Charles de Gaulle in his first visit to the Middle East. He said, "Je m'envole au Levant complexe avec des idées simples." I fly to the complex Middle East with simple ideas. So we cannot have simple ideas if we want to solve complexity in the Middle East. Thank you.
So the last speaker, but not the least, of course, is Professor Darko Tanasković. He has been academic all through all the academic degrees, and he's a full professor now. I do want to mention some of the subjects he's taught and teaching, which I find very fascinating: Arabic language, Arabic literature, Turkish language, Introduction to Oriental Studies, Persian literature, Introduction to Islamic Civilization, Islamic Christianity, Islamic Fundamentalism. Professor Tanasković has published over 700 papers and research work reports. He has taught in the Universities of Sarajevo, in Skopje, in the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He currently teaches at the Faculty of Orthodox Theology here in Belgrade, the Academy of Diplomacy and Security, and the Faculty of Political Sciences. And he's the president of the Council of the Diplomatic Academy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Serbia, and a member of the Foreign Policy Council of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has served as ambassador of Yugoslavia at the time to Turkey and Azerbaijan and the Holy See. And of course, he knows his topic very well. And now enjoying my role of asking questions instead of giving answers, which I find very rewarding. I wonder, first of all, if you compare, we could say that before the First World War, we had the empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and under those we had peace and stability and security. But the question is, and now we don't, is this what we need? Do the countries of these regions need a big brother to look after them? And since nobody has taken that role, now we have these conflicts and crises. And I would also add why these nations could live together during the Ottoman period or the Austro-Hungarian period, but they cannot live together now. And another question, did the European colonialists actually create artificial states and artificial borders, making conflicts inevitable? And did they do that on purpose? And that's not only in the region, it's that all over the world. So these would be some of my questions, but Professor, you have the floor, and we're looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kyprianou. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference that let me here speak in this panel. And I think that the first lesson, not to learn, but not to forget, is that the mankind generally don't learn lessons from history. Can we change that habitude? I'm not optimist, but we have always tried. At least here, we have a golden opportunity to learn from each other, and I think it is enough for us in this moment. I agree with Mr. Benaïssa that we always should speak about Middle East and North Africa. When the people say Middle East, they understand North Africa as well. But I think that it should be mentioned always because it gives another weight to what we are speaking about. And then what is absolutely clear is the Mediterranean is in the Brodelian meaning of the term is neglected, because Mediterranean is not only the Middle East, but it's Greece, it's Italy, it's part of Spain, and so on. I think that the Mediterranean dimension, for different reasons, has been even here neglected, but we should discuss that afterwards. According to the witty and classical formulation of David Fromkin, which is at the same time the title of his book, A Peace to End All Peace. It is partly I think, the answer to one of your questions. The First World War buried two empires, the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian, that in their coordinates and in their way provided for longer or shorter period general stability of the Middle East and the Balkans as well. While the borders between countries that were then, after the First War, drawn up, became a source of constant instability. 1 century after the end of the First World War, in the process of creating multipolar world through macro-regionalization, I am now introducing that concept that could be debated, but we don't have time. It is the hypothesis of several scholars as analysts, one of them being the Parag Khanna in his book, How to Run the World, from 2011. Well, in this multipolar world, which is now taking shape, through this process of macro-regionalization, in which several great states or powers or aggregation of states attempt to play the role of the centers of gravitation, Middle East and the Balkans remain out of total actual and potential control for any of those countries, making it a sin for their rivalries. Yes, indeed, actually in this very moment, the Middle East and North Africa are not the focus of interest of international community. But I think that it could change, as Mr. Issa said. Suddenly, it can re-become the focus. All those, geopolitically speaking, in the planetarian framework, they are not. Imagine, for instance, the collapse of Saudi Arabia, because the Arab Spring is not over. Well, imagine only the explosion or the implosion of the Saudi Arabia. I am absolutely sure that the Middle East will become overnight the focus of interest of international community, all the big players, particularly some of them. Is it the old game on again? Is the classical geopolitics at work again? I wouldn't be enthusiastic if it is, as Mr. Moratinos said, but in many respects it is. Because of that, we should not forget that some basic notions of the classical geopolitics, although it seems shameful to repeat that here among the people, knowledgeable people that are gathered here, specialists. But you should remember that according to Mackinder and the Euro-Asian world island theory and pivot area and heartland, which extends from the Volga to the Yangtze, from the Himalayas to the Arctic. He said, my concern with the general physical control rather than the causes of universal history. And 14 years later, it was in 94, but after the 14 years later, at the end of the Great War, when he was profoundly concerned with what he saw at the end, and the need was, according to his view, felt for an effective barrier of nations between Germany and Russia, Mackinder summarized his theory as follows. It's very famous. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island controls the world. This model has undergone several modifications since Mackinder. I will mention only the most famous one by Nicholas Spikeman in 42. For him, the key regional world politics was the coastal region bordering the heartland, which he called the Rimland. He changed Mackinder's formula accordingly. Who controls the Rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. In the Middle East and in the Balkans, we are in the Rimland. And this is very interesting. Who really controls the Rimland? And the Rimland isn't controllable at all. We've organized 2 years ago the conference, the Balkans and the Middle East. Are they mirroring each other? Interesting conclusions were reached on the typological level. There were but Israeli and Serbian scholars taking part here in the town of Peć, in Kosovo and Metohija, and in Belgrade. Well, I will now come to the main subject, which is how we can look at the Middle East and North Africa actually at the centenary of the big war. I will just put some, because you know it is always the privilege and the handicap to speak last. It is a privilege because you heard very interesting things and now you meditate, you can even enlarge your speech. But the handicap is that everybody is expecting logically to be the briefest and the shortest in your expose, and so I'll try just to do only some remarks. What is important, what happened after the First World War? In the First World War, the role of Islam and the Muslim states in the First World War were perceived, as it was said yesterday here by the predecessors, merely as a tool, instrumentally, and not as an autonomous actor on the world scene. For instance, Germany tried to foment the rebellion against enemies, and Britain in the other parts of the Middle East, and to weaken them that way. Then came the oil. Then came the colonization, the decolonization, the neocolonialism, neo-imperialism. Today, I think that the Islamic world, although it could seem differently, and the Muslim states are more important and challenging demographically than politically, as Mr. Sachs put yesterday in his speech during our dinner. And the massive, uncontrolled, and perhaps uncontrollable emigration towards Europe is a problem that Europe is facing, and not only Europe, but all the Mediterranean. When we speak about Middle East, it has been mentioned, I won't get back to that, it was the foundation of Israel, and the permanent tension and wars with its Arab neighbors, and practically the deadlock in the roadmap towards peace in the Israelo-Palestinian relations, although to, I think, all knowledgeable people and clever people, the common sense says the only, as it has been said here, the two states solution is possible, but not foreseeable, unfortunately, yet. In my eyes, the role of political Islam and the Islamic radicalization, terrorism, has been overemphasized because it can be really the threat and the challenges only if some other presuppositions had been fulfilled. And it not depends of the terrorists and of the Islamists, but other players which create the ground for that. Because the Islamic world, it's living its internal disorder, its fitna, as you remember, and Gilles Capel put even that at the title of his book, the fitna. There is not a monolithical block of Islamic countries. It's more devastated, as Mr. Benaïssa said. If we speak about security, interest, and identity, it was said yesterday, as the motives for political activity for the Muslim world, the identity is so crucial that I don't think that its identity could now really threaten anybody seriously in the world. It has been invented because some people thought that after the Cold War, in this logic of black and white, the Manichaean thinking, now you have to invent an enemy number one. For some people it could have been Islam, but definitely in my eyes it's not. Now we have the emergence of the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, which now lived its third winter. There is the problem of leadership. We don't have viable states, very few viable states, particularly after the interventions in Iraq, in Libya. Now the problem with Syria and other states, practically all strong leadership have been destroyed in the region. Then we have the very deepening and profound front, Sunni-Shia. It has been mentioned yesterday by Mr. Vuk Jeremic, stretching practically from Yemen to Afghanistan. Very serious and very dangerous split in the Muslim world. But I will here speak about one salient feature. It's very close to my academic interests, and it is Turkey. Why? Because it can be the illustration for what's going on actually in the Middle East. I won't speak very much about so-called neo-Ottomanism because we don't have time. It has been exposed in the book by Ahmed Davutoğlu, Strategic Depth. But although it is increasingly used in discussions about Turkey, the neo-Ottomanism had not been given a precise and unambiguous definition. However, the meaning of the term is clear in most cases. Neo-Ottomanism is mostly taken to signify a complex macro-ideological platform according to which present-day Turkey, as a legitimate civilization heir of the Ottoman Empire, should reaffirm its entire spiritual, cultural, and political legacy so that it could secure and effectively play the role of a global force to reckon with, and so on and so on. I won't speak about neo-Ottomanism. In my eyes, it's very logical and, in a certain sense, very legitimate idea of Turkey nowadays. But is it realistic? If it's not realistic, why it's not realistic? It is the question, and I will try to answer only in few words, although it deserves a discussion. You know, in regional terms, the priorities of new Turkish foreign policy are the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Balkans, regions which were part of the Ottoman Empire at some point in the past. Regarding the regional implementation of the principles of strategic depth doctrine, it is important to understand that Turkey primarily operates within the intention to realize its own interests even when its activities fall in with the strategic projection of a major global power for that region. If these Turkish interests can be fitted into a convenient, wider scenario, even better. But if not, Turkey will not hesitate to deviate from the plans of major powers. This has been amply demonstrated on several occasions in the past 10 years, especially in the Middle East. Turkey might be a regional commissioner on occasion, but never an unconditionally obedient one. Neo-Ottomanism precludes that sort of obedience. But neo-Ottomanists do not hesitate to use tactical maneuvering and compromise with the most powerful countries. And what happened? Turkey really achieved some goals, made really progress in the Balkans, in the Middle East. It's one of the very important countries now in the world. But it failed, particularly after the outspring of the Arab Spring. And when I come now to some remarks made by Mr. George Friedman today, I think that he is right in one thing. He said that the new, refreshed NATO for the second Cold War counts very much as pivotal countries on Poland, Romania, and Turkey. Is Turkey then autonomous, or Turkey will have almost the same role in the Second World War as it used to have in the First Cold War? Or the dream of neo-Ottomanism perhaps is only the illusion born between the two Cold Wars. I think this unsuccessful neo-Ottoman attempt by Turkey to impose itself as a macro-regional power is proof that there are no factors on the horizon that could provide for a long-term regional stability of the Middle East. The interior political weakening of European Union is also an indication that it will find it very hard to fulfill that same role in the Balkans. For instance, yesterday we had a visit of the Slovenian President Borut Pahor here, and in a very polite way, in his speech at the University of Belgrade, he practically said that the further enlargement of European Union after the outcome of the elections for the European Parliament is practically closed chapter in the foreseeable future. Then we shouldn't count in the foreseeable future to really resolve our problems to the European Union. Then Balkans and the Middle East remain this rimland, uncontrollable for a while, but very explosive, very problematic. And it was put now by the moderator, if we could find our own strength to solve these problems, that would be really ideal and very nice. But all the history teaches us differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We do have a few more minutes. We've got an extension. That's why you saw me on the phone here. I wasn't being rude. I was just trying to get a little more time. So have a few more minutes. If the panelists agree, we can get a couple of questions from the floor. Yes, please. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Former Foreign Minister from Senegal.
Thank you so much. I have to take to the topic of this panel to say a word, because that's the closest we get to Africa, because the mention of North Africa. And it has been a worry for us Africans to see that North Africa is being included in the Middle East. I remember telling our friends in the US, when they were talking about the greater Middle East, would go all the way to Morocco, that Morocco and Senegal used to be almost the same country. Therefore, if they include Morocco in the Middle East, they should include Senegal in the Middle East. And once I said that, I never heard about that again. So I'm truly worried about, I discussed this with my friends, of this center, that we are talking about the 1914 World War, and we do not mention Africa at all. I think it's a problem. Even the title, The European Tragedy of 1914, I wonder if it was not a world tragedy in 1914 rather than a European tragedy. And then the multipolar world. The world has never been unipolar, has always been multipolar, and often denied to be multipolar by Europe itself because of what is called Europeocentrism. And that's a problem that we need to think of. The world has changed Africa does not deserve to be forgotten when we talk about the world. Even our history was rewritten by people who believed that former ancient Egypt is not African. They dragged it to the Middle East or something else, but it is clear that it was not inhabited by Europeans or by Arabs, our brothers. It was inhabited by African people, and that's an African achievement. So today, when we say lessons learned, you wonder also if you should not have said lessons to be learned, because people have not learned lessons, and I agree with someone who mentioned that before. So basically, my question today is, the US is trying to redefine the world in its own terms. Europe is trying also the same exercise. China is here. India is coming. Brazil is coming. I think it's our chance this time around to recognize that the world cannot go one way. We have to recognize all people, all civilization, and one of the big consequences of 1914 was the emergence of those so-called third world countries and third world people. And I will end with one statement by Mahatma Gandhi that I found very profound. When he visited the first time the United Kingdom, journalists were running after him. And they told him, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? His answer was, it's a good idea. Thank you.
Yes, Sheikh Mohamed of Kuwait.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this panel very much, and I'm a little bit wondering what we are discussing here, the history lessons learned from historic event, the start of World War I. And I think that Francis Fukuyama's concept of end of history is not applicable to the Middle East. I think that a Jew who lives just across the street from the Temple Mount, where God chose Shoshana to rest, he is living history. It's not stopped the history to him. A Christian who lives in Nazareth, where Jesus was born, or in Jerusalem when Jesus was, the Last Supper and the crucifixions. History is not history. He's living in it. A Muslim who lives across the street from Mecca, or he lives in Mecca, next to to Kaaba, the house of God that was built by Abraham. History did not stop. He is living in it. So in that sense, the concept of history to people in the Middle East is a bit different, I think, from the rest of the world, because we are living in it constantly. So what happened in 1914, especially as far as the Middle East is concerned, the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot delineation, the Versailles Agreement, all, it's just like a second ago. It's not history. The concept that, usually when you talk about history, you talk about things happened long time ago and you have to accept it. But since we live with the Mount, the Temple Mount, and with the Jerusalem, with Mecca, history to us is a constant, ongoing event. So in that sense, what happened 100 years ago is not a fait accompli. We are actually living in it. So to come back to some of the from Haim, what he talked about, that nobody is paying attention now to the Arab-Israeli. We both Semites, we know how the waves of history moves. We look at the long wave, events here and there, like 100, 200 years. It's irrelevant. People today is not paying attention, but that does not mean it's on the wave. This is just a perpetration around a general trend, and the trend is that we are destined to. The Balfour Declaration. The letter said that His Majesty's government will accept in Palestine a homeland for the Jews. Now the concept has been changed now to a Jewish state, which is a bit different from the homeland of the Jews, which we as Arabs all accepted. We did not accept it at some point, but now with the Arab Peace Initiative accepted a homeland for the Jews in the partition Palestine. So in that sense, I think that one has to be sensitive to the overall historic trend that govern our behavior. Thank you very much.
And one last comment, and then I will ask if there are any comments from the panel, and then we finish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am the Turkish Ambassador Mehmet Bozay. It was such a comprehensive and illuminating panel. I learned a lot, especially His Excellency Aziz's words impressed me very much about the cultural dimension of what happened in the First World War and onwards. So I believe that we had a big chew during the First World War, and the world couldn't digest it, and all the things were put into deep freeze, and they were served again after 1991. All the conflicts that we see that emerged in the post-Cold War period, you can see the arrangements that were just mentioned by all panelists, the artificially drawn lines, some sectarian differences, creating some monarchies and other things. And I believe this new post-Cold War era, after the end of post-Cold War era, we entered a new period, a new phase that we should be very vigilant, very careful. And Turkey, we also made a comeback due to our connections, our historical bonds to the region. It's a wide region. It is Balkans, Caucasia, Middle East, and we have been always in these pictures. And now we are using our connections for the welfare of the region in a way that to bring some more stability, some peace, some welfare by using Turkey's capacity, which has been increased in recent years. In 2004, the then Foreign Minister Gül, now our President, made a very impressive statement in the Organization of Islamic Countries meeting in Jeddah, saying and asking that we should wrap up our kitchen cuisine. We should come back to our values, and the basic things he mentioned was democracy, human rights, rule of law, fighting against corruption, and providing a market economy. And later on, my Prime Minister made a statement in Al-Azhar University mentioning about Swig state. It is a concept which is very important in the Islamic world, to combine the participation of people in the administration with our own values. And in that sense, Turkey's policy is not something revitalizing the Ottoman Empire. There is no concept of neo-Ottomanism. And at least in my instructions here, as the Turkish ambassador, we always work on win-win situations. We would like to bring some more stability in the conflict areas. This is why we have 1 million refugees from Syria in our country, and this is why we would like to have better relations with all our neighbors. And the book of our minister mentions about having zero problem with all the neighbors in a way that to solve these problems and to give a benchmark for all of us. And in that sense, I believe to label it with some ideologies would be unjust, because to ask for welfare, to cooperate with other countries, and to use our historical cultural bonds with these countries, if we label it with some we should add neo-Germanism, neo-Russianism, we should add neo-Americanism. And I believe that these fashionable words, ideological labels might not correctly address the Turkey's policies, what Turkey is trying to do. Professor Tanasković is a very respectful academician. He's an expert on Turkey. But I think the concept of neo-Ottomanism is never mentioned, and it's not in the official policy of Turkey. Our policy is very clear to do and to have stability and welfare in the region altogether. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if the panel wants 1 minute intervention to take a bit of the European Parliament.
I want to be more precise. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lost the importance, the international importance, and even the regional importance. I'm not saying that if tomorrow something will happen in Saudi, the Arab winter or spring arrive to Saudi, all the world will pay attention. But to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it became a local issue. Without influence, even in the region, it's lost a lot of the importance, of course, on the international. This is as a fact, and I will finish by using Miguel Moratinos, my friend, as an example. When Miguel was the special envoy of Europe, the EU to the Middle East, it was a very important role. First, because of Miguel.
Of course.
And second, because the issue was important. Now, everybody knows in Israel, Moratinos here, Moratinos there. Oh, what we are going to do with these Moratinos? Now, nobody knows even the name of the special envoy of the European, special envoy of the EU to the Middle East. And this is to personalize the situation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very briefly, I like to tell my brother Sheikh Tijan Galju that because he was not here, I said something very important. I said that we cannot think of peace in Middle East without Africa, and vice versa. I mean, we don't have only the Red Sea in between, or the so-called North Africa. Africa, as such, is a complementary element and fundamental basis for peace, knowledge, and development in the future, and vice versa. I would say the Gulf countries should put more money into African resources and African development. That's where it belongs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And Miguel, more briefly than the others now.
Well, I think my message is that we should not look to the past. In 1914 or 1919, in Versailles Treaty, even Woodrow Wilson has the vision, the capacity to write 14 points and to have the vision of the new era, to defend American interests. And he declared self-determination for Africa, a new world. So what I will call the political class today is to have the same vision, but without war. And then if we abandon the balance of power, let's work together in a new collective security system where the parties have the right to decide by themselves. Our friend Gadio say, now the countries, the people are in a feeling that they can do by themselves, that the Palestinians, Israelis working together. So please don't come back to the Cold War. Please don't go back to all military alliance of the past. Create something new.
Warm war.
Well, they created the League of Nations, didn't work, but we have to create something new if we want to solve today's problem. If not, we will continue to fight, to have a crisis, and without no result.
Thank you. And Professor?
No, nothing specially. I just comment what my friend and Ambassador of Turkey said. This damn term of neo-Ottomanism is not important in itself. I can really accept another term if somebody coins it, but covering the same realities. Okay, it's not neo-Ottomanism, it's the actual ambitious politics of Turkey. Our Turkish friends, and I have really respect, and I say it's not important, sympathy for Turkey because I spent there very nice years, should understand that their political goals and their political philosophy is not, the perception of it, it's different in some parts of the world. And they have counted it, they have to take it on account. This is all. They think, yes, declaration is one thing, but deeds and words and deeds are two things. So we have the right to interpret that according to our vision, and I said personally twice today, in my eyes, it's legitimate and even logical politics of Turkey. If we were the Serbs, the Turks, I think we would perhaps behave in the same way. But it doesn't mean that we can accept all these politics as something very positive for the region and for us. We have to dialogue and to discuss. Fortunately or unfortunately, I really think that Mr. George Friedman is a very well-informed person. When he mentioned the Second Cold War, excuse me, it is the mistake Freudian as it was yesterday by our friend Pavlovich. Well, the Second Cold War and the role that Turkey should play, perhaps in the Second Cold War, with Poland and Romania in the refreshed NATO front. Well, he mentioned that, and I said, well, now Turkey is the end of the Turkish ambitions of the neo-Ottoman kind. And I will be sad if it happens, in better to have the neo-Ottoman Turkey realized here than to have the Second Cold War. But this is other problem, you know. The term in itself is not the problem, the substance is the problem.
So I would like to thank all the panelists on your behalf, thank the next panel and for the patience. We took up some of their time, and thank you all for listening to us and your patience. Thank you.
Thank you.